cold wind whistled through the broken windows of Blackridge Asylum, an abandoned psychiatric hospital that had stood on the outskirts of town for over a century. The building's decaying structure loomed over the overgrown grounds like a spectre from another time. The townsfolk whispered about the horrors that had once taken place within its walls, patients who had vanished, doctors who had gone mad, and a darkness that refused to be forgotten. Ethan Carter, a freelance journalist with a thirst for the unknown, had always been drawn to places like this. He had made a career out of investigating haunted locations, exposing myths, and debunking urban legends. But Blackridge Asylum was different. It wasn't just another spooky building with ghost stories. It had a history soaked in blood and secrets. When he received an anonymous email urging him to explore the asylum, he was intrigued. The message was brief and cryptic. "Come to Blackridge Asylum at midnight. Bring a camera. The truth is waiting." There was no sender information, no explanation, just a time and place. Ethan hesitated for a moment. It could be a prank, or worse, a setup. But the journalist in him couldn't resist. If there was something real hiding in that asylum, he had to uncover it. Midnight at Blackridge. At exactly 11:45 p.m., Ethan arrived at the asylum's front gates. The rusted metal creaked as he pushed them open. A heavy fog rolled over the ground, making the atmosphere even more unsettling. He adjusted his camera, turned on the night vision, and took his first steps inside. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. Peeling wallpaper revealed the crumbling foundation beneath, and old medical equipment lay scattered across the floors. Ethan's flashlight flickered as he moved deeper into the building, the silence pressing against him like an invisible force. As he entered what had once been the main lobby, a shiver ran down his spine. The grand reception desk was covered in old patient files, scattered as if someone had been searching through them. He picked one up. Patient 47, Elizabeth Monroe, diagnosis, schizophrenia and extreme paranoia, treatment, experimental therapy, records missing. The rest of the page had been torn away. Ethan frowned. Experimental therapy? He had read rumors about unethical practices at Blackridge, but there had never been any proof. If he could find more files, he might be able to expose something huge. Suddenly a loud bang echoed through the hall. Ethan whipped around, his heart pounding. A door at the end of the corridor had slammed shut on its own. He swallowed hard, reminding himself that old buildings made noises, that drafts could move doors. But as he lifted his camera to record, something caught his eye on the screen, a shadow, not his own, standing at the end of the hallway, and it was moving. The first encounter. Ethan's breath hitched as he stared at the figure. It was barely visible to the naked eye, but through the camera's night vision it became horrifyingly clear. A tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes and a twisted grin stood motionless in the darkness. Ethan took a cautious step back, but the figure lurched forward. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaking. No response. The figure moved again, this time faster. Ethan turned and bolted, his camera clutched tightly in his hand. His footsteps echoed through the empty halls as he reached the old patient ward. The doors to the rooms stood ajar, revealing rusted bed frames and shattered windows. He ducked into one of the rooms and pressed himself against the wall, forcing his breathing to slow. The hallway was silent, too silent. Then came the whisper. "Ethan, we've been waiting for you." His blood ran cold. The voice was soft, almost melodic, but filled with an eerie emptiness. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from inside the room. Ethan spun around, his flashlight flickering violently. For a split second, he saw something. Someone. Standing in the corner. A woman in a tattered hospital gown. Her eyes black voids. Her mouth twisted in an unnatural smile. And then she lunged. The escape that never happened. Ethan stumbled backward, crashing into the doorway as the figure vanished into thin air. His breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to make sense of what he had just seen. The asylum was supposed to be abandoned. This wasn't just paranoia. There was something here. As he bolted down the hallway, he heard footsteps behind him. Heavy, relentless footsteps. He didn't dare look back. Bursting through the doorway into what used to be the operation theater, he skidded to a halt. The room was wrong. The walls were lined with rusted surgical instruments, and the floor was stained dark with something that looked too much like dried blood. The operating table in the center was covered with old restraints, and above it, an overhead surgical light flickered weakly. But what made Ethan's stomach churn was the mirror. A massive cracked mirror stood against the far wall. His reflection was there, panting, wide-eyed, terrified. But he wasn't alone. Behind him a dozen figures stood, patients in hospital gowns, doctors in blood-stained coats. Their faces were hollow, their eyes empty pits of darkness. And then, as if pulled by an invisible force, the figures turned to face him in the reflection. One by one their mouths opened, releasing a low, guttural moan. Ethan stepped back, but his own reflection remained still. It was no longer mirroring him. The reflection smiled. "You shouldn't have come here, Ethan," it whispered. The lights went out. A deafening scream filled the air. And then, nothing. Silence. As if he had never been there. The darkness was suffocating. Ethan could hear his own ragged breathing, the hammering of his heart against his ribs. The asylum had swallowed him whole, trapping him in its labyrinth of horrors. The last thing he remembered was the mirror, his reflection smiling back at him before the lights went out. Now he was somewhere else. The cold was unbearable, seeping into his bones. The air smelled of damp rot and something metallic, blood. He reached for his camera, its faint green glow from night vision, the only thing keeping him from total blindness. The screen flickered, static running across it for a moment before revealing his surroundings. He was in a cell. The forgotten patients. The walls around him were made of stone, covered in scratches and crude symbols carved by desperate hands. Chains dangled from the ceiling, rusted from years of neglect. The floor was damp, puddles of black water reflecting the dim light from his camera. This wasn't a normal patient room. It was a prison. A faint sound echoed down the corridor, a soft, wet, dragging sound, like something was being pulled across the floor. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. He stepped toward the heavy metal door and pushed. It groaned in protest, but gave way. The hallway stretched before him, lined with more cells, their doors slightly ajar. He moved forward cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the decayed floor. Inside the cells, shadows shifted. Ethan stopped. He lifted his camera, slowly panning across the corridor. The night vision revealed figures, silent and still, lurking in the darkness. Patients, or what was left of them. They stood against the walls, their skeletal frames barely covered by tattered hospital gowns. Their faces were obscured in shadow, but their eyes were hollow pits of blackness. A whisper slithered through the air. "We never left." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. One of the figures moved, jerking forward, arms outstretched. The others followed, running from the past. Panic took over. Ethan turned and sprinted down the hallway, his boots splashing through the filthy water. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of desperate voices crying out, "Help us! Don't leave! They're coming!" Ethan didn't stop. He didn't dare look back. He burst through a rusted doorway at the end of the corridor and found himself in a massive underground chamber. The walls were lined with old medical equipment, electroshock therapy machines, syringes, and surgical tools coated in dried blood. A massive operating table sat in the center of the room, and standing beside it was her, Elizabeth Monroe, the woman from the patient files he found earlier, the one who had undergone experimental treatment. She wasn't human anymore. Her hospital gown was stained and torn, her skin unnaturally pale, stretched tightly over her bones. Her eyes were completely white, glowing with an unearthly light. Her mouth moved, but her voice echoed directly inside his head. "They did this to us, Ethan. You must see what they did." The lost experiments. The room shifted. The broken lights flickered to life, revealing a horrifying scene. Doctors in blood-stained coats surrounded the operating table, their faces obscured by surgical masks. A patient lay strapped down, screaming, thrashing violently. His skin was melting, boiling under some unseen force. His eyes rolled back, and then silence. The doctors murmured amongst themselves. One of them, a tall man with piercing blue eyes, removed his mask. He was calm, unbothered. Ethan recognized him, Dr. Nathaniel Graves, the man who had run Blackridge Asylum before it was shut down, the man accused of conducting inhumane experiments on patients. The doctor turned toward Ethan, though it was impossible. This was just a vision. But Graves saw him. "Ah, another visitor. You are just in time for your treatment." The vision shattered. Ethan was back in the abandoned operating room, but he was no longer alone. Dr. Graves stood before him, unchanged by time. His lab coat was pristine, his blue eyes filled with an unsettling amusement. Behind him, dozens of shadowy figures emerged from the walls, watching, waiting. Graves smiled. "Shall we begin?" Ethan stood, frozen. Dr. Nathaniel Graves loomed before him, his piercing blue eyes locked onto Ethan's, as if reading his thoughts. The air around him felt wrong, thick, suffocating, charged with an unnatural energy. The shadows in the room shifted, forming the twisted figures of the forgotten patients. Their hollow eyes bore into Ethan, their skeletal hands reaching out but stopping just short of touching him. "You came here looking for answers," Graves said, his voice disturbingly calm. "Now you must experience the truth." Before Ethan could react, the world collapsed around him. The asylum's darkest secret. Ethan's vision blurred as a sudden force pulled him backward, through time, through reality itself. When the world stabilized, he found himself standing in a pristine version of Blackridge Asylum. The walls were clean, the floors polished, and the scent of antiseptic filled the air. The asylum was alive, bustling with doctors, nurses, and patients. A younger version of Dr. Graves walked through the hall, surrounded by assistants in white coats. Ethan followed, unseen. They entered Ward C, the asylum's most restricted section. Inside, Ethan saw them. The patients weren't sick. They weren't insane. They were test subjects. Men, women, even children strapped to tables, their bodies convulsing as doctors injected them with strange glowing liquids. Some screamed in agony, their voices distorted, unnatural. Others simply disappeared, dissolving into the air as if they had never existed. Ethan's stomach twisted. The experiments weren't about curing mental illness. They were about erasing people, making them something else. The forgotten souls in rise. The vision shifted again. Ethan was back in the present, but the asylum was falling apart around him. The walls crumbled, the lights shattered, and the floor beneath him cracked open like a gaping wound. The forgotten patients screamed, a chorus of agony and rage. Dr. Graves stood amidst the chaos, unfazed. He turned to Ethan, his cold blue eyes filled with something dark and ancient. "You are part of this now, Ethan." The doctor lifted his hand, and an invisible force slammed into Ethan's chest, sending him flying across the room. He crashed against an old gurney, gasping for breath. Then the whispering started. "Join us. Let go. Become one of us." Ethan refused. He scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He had to end this. His camera, the only thing that had captured everything, was still in his grip. If he could get out, he could expose the truth. But first, he had to survive. The final escape. The spirits lunged. Ethan ran. The asylum was collapsing, the walls twisting and distorting like a living nightmare. He dodged falling debris, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. The exit was ahead. The front door that had been locked before was now wide open. But standing in the doorway was Elizabeth Monroe. She was different now, no longer just a ghost, but something else, something powerful. Her eyes, once empty voids, now burned with light. "Go," she whispered. The spirits hesitated. Ethan didn't. He bolted through the door, past Elizabeth, and into the night. The moment he stepped outside, an earth-shaking roar erupted behind him. He turned just in time to see the asylum implode, the structure collapsing in on itself as if it had never existed. The screams of the forgotten souls faded into the wind. And then there was silence, the aftermath. Ethan's camera was still recording. He stared at the asylum's remains, a pile of rubble where a century of horror had been buried. The world felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted, but he knew the truth. Blackridge Asylum was gone, but its secrets would never truly disappear. Somewhere in the darkness, Dr. Graves was still waiting, and Ethan had a choice. Expose the truth, or bury it forever. As he walked away, he whispered to himself, "Some places are abandoned for a reason."